March 6, 1944. Imagine a cold, crystal-clear sky 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany, on March 6, 1944. Major Hans Kogler, his oxygen mask freezing to his face, was leading his Luftwaffe formation toward what he believed would be an easy kill, a stream of unescorted American heavy bombers. German defensive strategy was built on a single, unwavering scientific fact. No Allied single-engine fighter possessed the range to penetrate this deep into the Reich, less than 50 miles from Berlin, and return home. The bombers, according to every calculation, were vulnerable. Then a warning crackled through Kogler's headset, laced with panic. Single-engine fighters with drop tanks high at 12 o'clock. Kogler's blood turned to ice water. It was impossible, a physical violation of their carefully plotted defense. As he watched the silver shapes grow larger, their sleek profiles became unmistakable. These were not the short-legged P-47 Thunderbolts or twin-boomed P-38 Lightnings. These were North American P-51B Mustangs, moving through German airspace with the predatory confidence of an aircraft that knew it had fuel to burn, altitude to spare, and all the time in the world to hunt. Kogler, leading his men toward the approaching 730 bombers of the 8th Air Force, understood with horrifying clarity that he was witnessing the beginning of the end, a moment that would trigger the most profound psychological collapse in the history of German air superiority. The psychological destruction had been months in the making, fueled by the Luftwaffe High Command's categorical refusal to believe the evidence. Earlier in 1944, reports of American single-engine fighters spotted over Hanover, nearly 150 miles deeper into Germany than previously thought possible, were dismissed as hallucinations or combat fatigue. The Reich Air Ministry eventually issued a directive stating that any pilot claiming to have seen P-51s beyond the Ruhr would be subject to medical evaluation, holding firm to the belief that the math was simple. Fuel capacity divided by consumption rate equaled range, and the Americans could not change the laws of physics. German pilot Hans Nock wrote in his diary that their entire central and eastern Germany was supposed to be a safe hunting ground, where they could attack the bomber streams without interference, based on the belief that American escorts would be forced to turn back at the 280-mile mark. The German High Command was wrong, because while the Americans hadn't changed the laws of physics, they had applied them with far greater creativity. The secret to the Mustang's impossible range lay in two revolutionary innovations missed or dismissed by German intelligence: the Packard-built Merlin and the British-designed paper drop tanks. The Mustang's Packard Merlin was a triumph of engineering efficiency, an improved copy of the Rolls-Royce engine manufactured using American mass production techniques refined in Detroit's automotive plants. It produced phenomenal power at high altitude thanks to its two-stage supercharger. But what truly shocked German technicians who examined crashed P-51s was the production quality. One technical specialist realized that every component was machined to jeweler's precision, yet the Americans claimed to build 3 of these engines every hour. He concluded chillingly, "If true, this is not a war of pilots, but of production lines." The drop tanks, however, were the key to the strategic revolution. German engineers, philosophically opposed to the idea of disposable parts, had designed heavy, reusable metal auxiliary tanks that severely degraded fighter performance. In contrast, the Americans used cheap, lightweight, disposable tanks made from paper and resin, weighing only 35 pounds empty. A P-51 could cruise all the way to Berlin on this external fuel, jettison the tanks in seconds just before combat, and then fight with a full internal fuel load, maintaining peak performance. As one American commander explained, "We could burn fuel like millionaires. We weren't flying on the edge anymore. We had margin to burn." The arrival of the Mustangs over Berlin on March 6th was the powerful American response to Black Thursday, October 14, 1943, when the unescorted 8th Air Force had been nearly broken over Schweinfurt, suffering a 20.6% loss rate. That day had convinced General Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, that unescorted daylight bombing was a failed concept. But Galland had fundamentally miscalculated, believing the Americans would accept technological limitations rather than solve them. On the day of the Berlin raid, Major Thomas Hayes, leading 33 Mustangs through difficult weather, broke through the clouds and spotted Major Kogler's unsuspecting German formation, who were completely focused on the bombers. Hayes dove on the enemy fighters, giving the command, "Drop tanks and attack." What followed was less a battle and more an execution. One surviving German pilot, overwhelmed with disbelief over the capital, saw the tanks falling away and knew instantly, These were real American fighters with range we hadn't imagined possible. In 12 minutes of combat, the Mustangs claimed 20 German aircraft without a single loss. When Reich Marshal Goering received the news at his estate north of Berlin that single-engine American fighters were over the capital, his rage was volcanic. He threw his wineglass against the wall and screamed, calling it treason and sabotage. That evening, Goering issued his most infamous order of the air war. Any pilot who claimed to have seen P-51s over Berlin was to be arrested for cowardice and spreading defeatist propaganda, insisting that the range was a scientific fact. Days later, when Gallon presented Goering with a recovered piece of a P-51 drop tank, clearly stamped Made in USA, Goering's final, legendary retort was, "I don't care if you bring me a whole Mustang on a silver platter. The Americans cannot escort to Berlin. It's scientifically impossible." It was at this moment, Gallon would later write, that Germany had lost the war. For the individual Luftwaffe pilots, the appearance of the Mustangs was an existential crisis. They had been repeatedly told they were defending an impregnable fortress with superior technology. Now, their entire concept of safety was gone. Pilot Hans Nock wrote a devastating entry the following day. "We are no longer hunters, but the hunted, even over our own capital." The P-51 was a superior opponent, faster than the Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6 at altitude, and flown by fresh pilots who were not fatigued from hours of watching their fuel gauges. German veterans described the Mustangs as fighting like they had unlimited fuel, making multiple passes and toying with them like cats with mice. More devastating than the tactical shock was the strategic collapse that followed. The Mustang's long-range escort immediately enabled the complete destruction of Germany's synthetic fuel production. These crucial plants, which converted coal to aviation gasoline, had previously been immune to attack because they were too far inland to be accurately bombed with fighter escort. The P-51 changed this equation overnight. On May 12, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first major attack against the Luna fuel plant, an attack that was overwhelmingly successful. Production at Luna dropped 90% overnight. By September 1944, German aviation fuel production had plummeted to barely enough to fuel 500 sorties per day across all fronts, leading to the total cancellation of training flights. This led to what historians call the death of the expert. New Luftwaffe pilots, once trained for 250 hours, were now sent into combat with as little as 20 hours of total flight time, against American pilots who arrived with 400 to 500 hours. The result was a horrific attrition rate. The average life expectancy of a new German fighter pilot in January 1945 was just 7 missions. It was, as veteran Johannes Steinhoff described it, murder, not combat. The P-51 also ensured no German factory was safe, relentlessly destroying production centers and forcing the dispersal of manufacturing to inefficient, hidden facilities. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister for Armaments, testified that while Germany produced more fighters in 1944 than ever before, the losses exceeded production. The Luftwaffe was losing aircraft faster than even the world's most efficient industrial economy could build them. In desperation, the Luftwaffe resorted to increasingly suicidal tactics, such as the Sturmgruppe flying tanks, heavily armored FW-190s designed to ram or bore straight through the escort screens. These flying coffins were so slow that the Mustangs could simply make multiple firing passes at leisure. Even the arrival of the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter could not reverse the tide. Despite being 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51, the Luftwaffe lacked the fuel and training to use them effectively. The Mustangs adapted by hunting the jets on the ground, striking them during their vulnerable takeoff and landing phases. As Galan noted, for every minute we were in the air, Mustangs were overhead for an hour. The final futile spasm of the Luftwaffe was Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945, a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields that successfully destroyed many planes but cost the Luftwaffe its last reserves of 271 aircraft and 213 irreplaceable veteran pilots. It was their death ride. Burning their final reserves of fuel to destroy aircraft the Americans replaced within a week. By 1945, pilots were refusing to fly, not out of cowardice, but from the logical recognition that taking off meant certain death.
In his final published diary entry, pilot Hein Koch captured the complete defeat. "I am no longer a fighter pilot. I am a target waiting to be killed." In post-war interviews, surviving Luftwaffe pilots were remarkably candid. Adolf Galland stated plainly that the P-51 Mustang was the decisive weapon in the air war. He concluded, "Once it appeared over Berlin, we knew the war was lost. It was like a chess game where your opponent suddenly has queens that can move anywhere on the board." Johannes Steinhoff, who went on to lead the post-war German Air Force, echoed this, saying the Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed the very concept of German air superiority. Years later, a former German pilot told an American Mustang ace, "When we saw your Mustangs over Berlin that first time, it was like discovering the ocean had no end. It broke something in us. Not just our will to fight, but our faith in everything we had been told." The P-51 Mustang's impossible arrival over Berlin was more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic catastrophe that consumed an entire generation of German aviators and fundamentally changed the nature of air warfare forever.